At 0700 on December 27, 1944, Flight Officer Robert Mitchell sat in the cockpit of a Waco CG-4A glider at an airfield in France, watching ground crews load high-explosive ammunition into the cargo bay behind him. 24 years old, 15 training flights, 0 combat missions. The Germans had concentrated 88mm flak batteries along every approach to Bastogne, and yesterday's glider mission had already cost 5 tow planes and 17 gliders. The CG-4A was constructed of fabric-covered metal tubing with a plywood floor. No armor, no engine, no parachute. The entire aircraft weighed 3,900 pounds empty. Loaded with 3 tons of ammunition, it would weigh 9,000 pounds. Pilots called them flying coffins. Others called them tow targets or plywood hearses. Mitchell's orders were simple. Ride a 300-foot nylon rope behind a Douglas C-47 through the flak corridor, cut loose at 600 feet, glide into a perimeter surrounded by German forces, and deliver the ammunition to the 101st Airborne Division trapped inside Bastogne. 7 days earlier, on December 16th, 200,000 German troops had launched Hitler's final gamble in the West. The offensive punched a 60-mile bulge through American lines in the Ardennes forest. Panzer columns had advanced faster than Allied commanders thought possible. By December 20th, the screaming eagles of the 101st Airborne found themselves encircled in Bastogne, a crossroads town with 7 highways converging at its center. 11,000 paratroopers, surrounded, cut off, running out of everything. General Anthony McAuliffe had responded to a German surrender demand with a single word: nuts. But defiance didn't feed soldiers or reload empty weapons. The division's entire field hospital had been captured on December 19th. 42 medics and surgeons, gone. By Christmas, the remaining medics were operating with kitchen knives and bedsheets. Artillery battalions were rationing shells. Tank crews were siphoning fuel from destroyed vehicles. Soldiers were down to 10 rounds per rifle. The weather had been too bad to fly for 6 days straight. Yesterday, December 26th, had finally brought clear skies. 11 gliders had delivered 5 surgeons and medical supplies in the afternoon. Mitchell had watched them land from the operations tent. Clean mission, no losses. Then, Patton's tanks broke through from the south 40 minutes later, and everyone thought the crisis was over. But breaking the siege didn't end the battle. The corridor Patton opened was barely 1,000 yards wide. German forces still surrounded 3 sides of the perimeter. The 101st needed ammunition to hold their positions until reinforcements could arrive in force. Artillery rounds, machine gun belts, mortar shells, rifle cartridges, 3,000 pounds per glider, 50 gliders dispatched this morning, all heading into the same killing zone the Germans had been targeting for a week. The mission briefing had been clear about the risks. Intelligence reported that German flak crews had the approach route registered. Every gun within 5 miles had the coordinates. 88mm cannons, quad-mounted 20mm guns. The flight path went straight over enemy positions because there was no other way in. Fighter escorts couldn't suppress the flak without hitting the gliders. The C-47 pilots would climb to 6,000 feet, then dive to 600 for glider release. Maximum exposure time in the flak zone, 4 minutes. The glider pilots would be on their own from 8 miles out. Mitchell's squadron commander had made one decision that everyone understood but nobody talked about: no co-pilots. The cargo was too dangerous. If flak hit a glider loaded with high explosives, both pilots would die anyway. Better to risk 1 trained pilot per aircraft than 2. Mitchell would fly alone. 50 gliders, 50 pilots, single-seat missions. He'd volunteered for glider training 6 months earlier because it seemed safer than jumping out of planes with a parachute. The recruiter hadn't mentioned missions like this. Mitchell checked his watch. 0745. Takeoff in 15 minutes. 50 gliders waiting on the runway. All of them volunteers. All of them knowing the odds. During training, instructors said to expect 50% casualties on combat missions. Yesterday's numbers suggested the real figure might be higher. If you want to see whether Mitchell's wooden glider made it through the flak corridor, please hit that like button. Every like helps us share stories about pilots who flew missions the history books forgot. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Mitchell. He looked through the glider's nose at the ammunition crates stacked behind him. High explosives, artillery shells, mortar rounds. One tracer round through the fuselage and he'd vaporize before he felt anything. The fabric skin wouldn't stop a rifle bullet. Mitchell had written a letter to his mother the night before. He'd sealed it, addressed it, left it on his bunk with his personal effects, just in case. The tow rope tightened. His C-47 was starting its engines. The rope stretched across 50 feet of frozen runway. In 30 minutes, Mitchell would either be on the ground in Bastogne delivering ammunition to men who desperately needed it, or he'd be scattered across a frozen Belgian field. He gripped the control stick, and he was about to find out which. The C-47's engines roared to full power at 0800. Mitchell felt the tow rope snap tight. His glider lurched forward. No brakes, no throttle, just momentum and physics. The wooden aircraft accelerated down the frozen runway behind the tow plane. 60 miles per hour, 70. At 85, the glider lifted off the ground. Mitchell pulled back on the control stick to match the C-47's climb angle. The rope between them stayed taut. One wrong move, and the rope would snap or the glider would stall. Either meant death. Behind Mitchell's glider, 49 more CG-4As were taking off in a steady stream. The 439th Troop Carrier Group was launching 37 gliders from this airfield. The 440th Troop Carrier Group was launching 13 more from Orléans. 50 gliders total, 50 pilots, 150 tons of ammunition heading toward Bastogne, the largest glider resupply mission of the war. Mitchell had arrived at glider training school in May 1944. The program promised flight status without requiring a college degree. Most Army Air Force's pilots needed 2 years of college. Glider pilots only needed to pass the physical and survive the course. Mitchell had grown up on a farm in Iowa. High school diploma, strong back, good eyes. The recruiter said glider pilots would deliver troops and supplies behind enemy lines. He didn't say they'd be flying wooden boxes through flak. The training had been brutal. 12 weeks, 60% washout rate. Students learned to land gliders in fields marked with stakes representing trees and obstacles. No engine meant no second approach. Get it right the first time or crash. Mitchell had watched 2 classmates die during landing practice. Another broke his back. But he'd graduated, earned his silver G-wings, got assigned to the 439th Troop Carrier Group in England, made it through D-Day without flying, sat out Market Garden because his unit wasn't scheduled. And now, 6 months after pinning on his wings, he was finally heading into combat. The C-47 climbed to 6,000 feet. Mitchell's glider stayed 200 feet below and behind the tow plane. Formation flying in a glider required constant attention. Too high, and the rope would pull the C-47's tail down. Too low, and the glider would lose lift and fall. Mitchell watched his airspeed. 120 miles per hour, standard tow speed. His hands stayed light on the controls. Small corrections. The glider wanted to fly straight. Let it. Below, the French countryside slid past. Villages, roads, forests stripped bare by winter. The American lines were 30 miles ahead. The German lines were 10 miles beyond that. Bastogne sat another 15 miles inside German-held territory. Total flight time, 90 minutes. But the critical moment would come in the last 10 minutes when they crossed into the flak zone. Mitchell looked left and right. Other gliders were visible in the formation. Fabric-covered wings, plywood fuselages, each one loaded with enough explosives to level a city block. The pilots had discussed the ammunition problem during the briefing. If German flak hit the cargo bay, the glider wouldn't just crash, it would explode. The pilot wouldn't feel anything. One moment flying, next moment, gone. Some of the pilots said that was better than burning alive or getting shot down over enemy territory. Mitchell didn't want to think about either option. The weather was holding. Clear skies, light winds. Temperature 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Good conditions for flying. Also good conditions for German gunners. Yesterday's mission had landed in late afternoon when the Germans weren't expecting gliders. Today's mission was launching in broad daylight with the Germans fully alert. Intelligence estimated that the flak corridor had doubled its gun positions overnight. The Germans knew more gliders were coming. Mitchell checked his watch. 0830. 60 minutes until they reached the release point. 60 minutes to think about what came next. Some pilots handled the waiting by talking on the intercom with their tow plane crews. Others stayed quiet. Mitchell fell into the second category. He'd said everything he needed to say in the letter on his bunk. The formation crossed into Belgium, enemy territory below. The gliders maintained tight spacing. If the lead elements got hit by flak, the trailing gliders would fly straight through the debris. There was no room to maneuver, no way to dodge. The mission plan called for a straight approach at 600 feet, maximum vulnerability, minimum time over the target. The math was simple. Get in fast, cut loose, land, survive. Mitchell's glider hit turbulence. The wooden frame creaked. The fabric skin rippled. He corrected with the stick. The glider steadied. Everything about the CG-4A was designed to be expendable. Light materials, simple construction, no expensive components. Built by furniture companies and refrigerator manufacturers. Cost $14,000 per glider. A P-51 Mustang cost $50,000. The Army considered gliders disposable. The formation approached the front lines. Mitchell could see smoke rising from artillery positions below, American guns firing east toward German positions. In 15 minutes, those same German positions would be firing back at Mitchell's glider, and there was nothing he could do but hold his course and hope the flak missed. At 0920, the lead C-47 crossed into German-held territory. Mitchell was flying in the middle of the formation, 20 gliders ahead of him, 29 behind. The tow planes maintained 6,000 feet. The gliders stayed at 5,800. Below, the landscape changed. Fewer villages, more fortifications. Trenches zigzagging through frozen fields. This was the Bulge. 60 miles of German-controlled Belgium. The first flak appeared 8 miles from Bastogne. Black puffs of smoke erupting at 5,000 feet. 88mm shells. The German gunners were ranging on the formation. Mitchell watched the puffs march closer. The C-47 pilots couldn't evade. Any maneuvering would tangle the tow ropes or throw the gliders out of formation. They had to fly straight through. A shell burst 200 feet to Mitchell's left. The blast wave rocked his glider. Shrapnel tore through the fabric skin near the tail. Mitchell felt the control stick shudder. The rudder was damaged, but still functional. He made a small correction. The glider held course. Another burst. Closer this time. 100 feet ahead. The smoke drifted through the formation. Mitchell flew through it blind for 3 seconds. When he emerged, he could see the glider in front of him was trailing smoke. The damaged glider started losing altitude. Its left wing had taken shrapnel. The fabric was shredded. The wooden frame was visible through the tears. The pilot was fighting to maintain control, but the glider was going down. Mitchell watched it fall away from formation. The pilot didn't have enough altitude to reach Bastogne. He'd have to put down in German territory. If the ammunition didn't explode on impact, the Germans would capture him. If it did explode, he'd be dead before his glider hit the ground. More flak. The German gunners had the range now. Shells were bursting inside the formation. Mitchell saw a C-47 take a direct hit. The tow plane's left engine erupted in flames. The pilot tried to maintain altitude, but the engine fire spread to the wing. The crew bailed out. 4 parachutes. The glider they'd been towing cut loose and went into a dive. No pilot could control a glider in a vertical descent. It hit the ground 7 seconds later and exploded. The blast was visible from 6,000 feet. A pillar of orange flame and black smoke. Mitchell counted the losses. 2 gliders down. 1 C-47 down. 5 miles still to go. The flak intensified. The Germans were firing everything they had. 20mm guns joined the 88s. Tracers streaked up through the formation. Mitchell heard metal tearing somewhere behind him. Another glider hit. He didn't look back. Looking wouldn't change anything. The C-47 ahead and to Mitchell's right took multiple hits. The tow plane's right engine was smoking. The pilot maintained formation for another 30 seconds. Then the engine seized. The propeller stopped turning. The C-47 couldn't hold altitude on one engine while towing a 9,000-pound glider. The towplane pilot released the glider early, 4 miles from Bastogne. The glider pilot would have to make it the rest of the way on his own. Mitchell watched the released glider begin its descent. 4 miles. Maybe doable, maybe not. At 60 miles per hour glide speed, the glider would cover 4 miles in 4 minutes, but it was also losing altitude at 400 feet per minute. Starting altitude, 5,800 feet. Required altitude to clear German positions and reach the American perimeter, at least 500 feet. The math was tight. A shell burst directly beneath Mitchell's glider. The blast lifted the entire aircraft 20 feet. Mitchell fought the controls. The glider pitched forward. He pulled back hard on the stick. The nose came up. The glider stabilized. But now he could feel vibrations through the airframe. Something was damaged. The landing gear, maybe. Or the wing struts. He'd find out when he tried to land. 3 miles from Bastogne. The flak was so thick, Mitchell could smell the cordite through the holes in his fuselage. Another glider exploded to his left. Direct hit. The ammunition cargo detonated mid-air. The blast was close enough that Mitchell felt the heat through his cockpit window. Debris from the destroyed glider peppered his right wing. More fabric tears. More structural damage. 2 miles. The C-47, pulling Mitchell's glider, started its descent. 6,000 feet down to 600. Dive angle, 30 degrees. The tow rope went slack for a moment as the tow plane accelerated downward. Then it snapped tight again as Mitchell's glider caught up. The descent was supposed to reduce exposure time in the flak zone, but it also meant flying through the heaviest concentration of anti-aircraft fire at the lowest altitude. 1 mile. Mitchell could see Bastogne ahead, smoke rising from the town. American positions marked by foxholes and sandbag walls. The perimeter was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 2 miles across, surrounded by German forces on 3 sides, and he was about to land right in the middle of it, if he made it that far. The release light flashed red on Mitchell's instrument panel. Cut loose now. He pulled the tow rope release. The rope fell away. His C-47 banked hard left and climbed. Mitchell was on his own. 600 feet of altitude. 1 mile to the landing zone. 60 seconds of flight time remaining, and the German gunners knew exactly where he was going. Mitchell's glider dropped through 600 feet. No engine, no power. Just gravity and forward momentum. He aimed for a snow-covered field north of Bastogne. American foxholes ringed the perimeter. Soldiers were waving orange panels to mark the landing zone. The field looked clear, but Mitchell knew appearances meant nothing. German artillery had been pounding this area for a week. Craters, unexploded shells, debris, any of it could flip a glider on landing. 500 feet. German 20mm tracers arced up from positions 400 yards east. The gunners were tracking his descent. Mitchell couldn't evade. The glider's control surfaces were already damaged from flak. He had maybe 30 degrees of turn authority left, not enough to dodge ground fire. He kept his approach angle steady, 45 degrees nose down, 60 miles per hour, standard glider approach, 400 feet. A tracer round punched through his right wing, clean through. The fabric tore. The wooden rib behind it cracked. Mitchell felt the glider yaw right. He corrected with left rudder. The rudder responded, but the pressure felt wrong. More structural damage. He'd have to land fast before something failed completely. 300 feet. The landing zone was coming up fast. Mitchell could see individual soldiers now, men running toward the field with stretchers and equipment. They knew what was in these gliders. 3 tons of ammunition per aircraft. The 101st had been rationing bullets for 6 days. Every round counted. Every glider that landed intact meant more soldiers would have ammunition to hold their positions. 200 feet. Mitchell pulled back on the stick to flare the glider. The nose came up. The descent rate slowed. 100 feet. 50. He was coming in too fast, but there was no way to slow down. The landing gear hit frozen ground at 70 miles per hour. The right wheel collapsed immediately. The damaged landing strut buckled. The glider's right wing dropped and hit the ground. The impact tore off 8 feet of wing. The fuselage skidded sideways across the snow. Mitchell hung onto the control stick as the glider spun. The tail section broke off. The cockpit separated from the cargo bay. The wooden frame disintegrated around him. Then the glider stopped. Mitchell was alive. The ammunition hadn't exploded. He was sitting in what was left of a cockpit, in the middle of a frozen Belgian field, with German positions 400 yards away. Soldiers reached the wreckage within 30 seconds. A sergeant yanked open Mitchell's cockpit door. "Can you move?" Mitchell nodded. He unbuckled his harness and climbed out. His legs were shaking. The sergeant pointed toward a tree line. "Medic station's that way. Get yourself checked. We'll unload the cargo." Mitchell looked back at the wreckage. The ammunition crates were intact. The soldiers were already pulling them free. More gliders were coming in. Mitchell watched from the medic station as the next wave approached. Some landed clean. Others came in hard like his had. One glider overshot the landing zone and crashed into a stone wall. The impact killed the pilot instantly. Another landed in a minefield. The explosions destroyed the glider and scattered ammunition across 100 yards. Soldiers ran into the minefield to recover what they could. 3 men were wounded retrieving mortar shells. By 0950, 32 gliders had landed inside the perimeter. Mitchell counted them from the medic station while a corpsman bandaged a cut on his forehead. 32 out of 50 dispatched. 18 missing. Some had been shot down over German positions. Others had crash-landed short of the perimeter. A few had exploded in the air. The exact count wouldn't be known until after the battle. But 32 gliders meant 96 tons of ammunition had reached the 101st. Artillery crews were already unloading shells. Infantry companies were distributing rifle cartridges. Tank destroyers were getting rounds for their 76mm guns. The ammunition wouldn't win the battle by itself, but it would let the Screaming Eagles keep fighting until reinforcements arrived. Mitchell walked through the perimeter. The town was a wreck. Buildings had been shelled into rubble. Roads were cratered. Dead German soldiers lay frozen in the streets from previous attacks. American soldiers occupied every defensible position. Foxholes, basements, the remains of stone walls. They'd been surrounded for 7 days. They looked exhausted, but they were still fighting. A lieutenant from the 502nd Parachute Infantry stopped Mitchell. "You one of the glider pilots?" Mitchell nodded. The lieutenant shook his hand. "We were down to 8 rounds per man this morning. You just gave us 50. Thank you." Mitchell didn't know what to say. The lieutenant was already moving toward his position with a box of .30 caliber ammunition. The mission had cost 17 gliders shot down, 5 C-47s destroyed, at least 20 pilots killed. The casualty rate was 32%, higher than D-Day, higher than Market Garden, higher than any previous glider operation in the European theater. The Army Air Forces would later call it one of the deadliest glider missions of the war, but the ammunition got through, and that was what mattered. The 101st Airborne would hold Bastogne for another 3 weeks until the German offensive collapsed. The resupply missions on December 26th and 27th had kept them in the fight during the most critical 48 hours. Mitchell sat on an ammunition crate and watched the last gliders land. He'd made it, somehow, against odds that should have killed him, and now he had to figure out how to get back to his unit, because glider pilots didn't just deliver cargo. Once they landed, they became infantry, and Mitchell was about to learn what it meant to fight on the ground in Bastogne. Glider pilots were trained to fly, not to fight on the ground, but Army doctrine was clear. Once a glider landed, the pilot became an infantryman until he could return to base. Mitchell had fired a rifle during basic training 18 months earlier. He'd qualified marksman. That was the extent of his combat infantry experience. Now he was standing in a perimeter surrounded by German forces with a borrowed M1 Garand and 40 rounds of ammunition. A captain from the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment assigned Mitchell to a rifle company, holding positions along the northern edge of town. The company had started the siege with 140 men. They were down to 93. Casualties from artillery, small arms fire, and trench foot. The company commander was a first lieutenant who looked about 22 years old. He pointed Mitchell toward a foxhole. "You're with Corporal Hansen, 2-man position, 4-hour shifts. Germans probe our lines every night around 0200. Stay alert." Mitchell found Hansen's foxhole 50 yards from the company command post. Hansen was a paratrooper from the 501st. He jumped into Normandy on D-Day, jumped into Holland during Market Garden. Now he was dug into frozen Belgian soil, holding a section of perimeter with a glider pilot who'd never been in ground combat. Hansen looked Mitchell over. "You know how to use that rifle?" Mitchell nodded. Hansen didn't look convinced. The foxhole was 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep. 2 men could fit if they stayed low. The bottom was lined with pine branches and a salvaged blanket, not enough to stop the cold. Hansen had been in this hole for 4 days. The temperature was dropping. Forecast called for 15 degrees Fahrenheit tonight. Mitchell settled into the foxhole and tried to orient himself. The company's sector covered 300 yards of perimeter, 14 foxholes, 28 men, facing an estimated 2 companies of German infantry across a frozen field. The nearest German position was 200 yards out, close enough that Mitchell could hear them talking at night. Hansen explained the rules. No fires, no smoking after dark, no unnecessary movement. The Germans had the perimeter ranged for artillery. Any activity drew shells within 5 minutes. Mitchell asked about the glider that had crashed into the minefield. Hansen said the pilot had died on impact. 2 soldiers were wounded recovering the ammunition, but they'd retrieved 800 pounds of mortar shells before giving up. Every round counted. The company's mortar section had been down to 12 shells this morning. Now they had enough to respond to a German attack. Night fell at 1700. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees. Mitchell had a wool overcoat and gloves, but the cold seeped through everything. Hansen showed him how to stay warm. Keep moving your toes inside your boots. Clench and unclench your fingers. Don't let your body go numb. Trench foot could cost you your toes. Frostbite could cost you your fingers. Both could kill you as surely as German bullets. At 1930, German artillery opened up. 88mm shells impacted across the perimeter. The barrage lasted 10 minutes. Mitchell pressed himself against the bottom of the foxhole. The explosions walked across the company sector. One shell hit 30 yards away. Shrapnel tore through the air overhead. Hansen didn't react. He'd been through this before. When the barrage lifted, Hansen checked for casualties. 1 man wounded in the next foxhole over. Shrapnel to the leg. He'd live. At 2200, the company pulled back 1 foxhole at a time to eat. Cold rations. K-ration boxes, crackers and cheese, canned ham, coffee powder mixed with cold water because hot coffee would show up on German thermoscopes. Mitchell ate mechanically. The food had no taste. Hansen said you stopped noticing after the first week. At 0100 on December 28th, German infantry probed the perimeter. Mitchell heard them moving across the frozen field, boots crunching on snow, equipment rattling. Hansen whispered, "Wait for the flare." 60 seconds later, an American mortar crew fired an illumination round. The flare burst 300 feet up and drifted down on a parachute. White light flooded the field. Mitchell saw them. 15 German soldiers advancing in a skirmish line, 200 yards out, moving toward the American positions. Hansen opened fire. The rest of the company followed. The Germans went to ground. Some fired back. Others tried to withdraw. The firefight lasted 3 minutes. When it ended, 4 German soldiers were down in the snow. The rest had pulled back. Hansen reloaded his rifle. They'll try again in an hour. Same thing every night. They probe, we shoot. They pull back. Then they shell us. Then we wait for the next probe. Mitchell asked why they kept trying. Hansen shrugged. Because they think we'll break eventually. And they're not wrong. We're running out of men. The company had lost 47 soldiers in 7 days, 23 killed, 24 wounded. At this rate, they'd be combat ineffective in another week. The glider resupply had given them ammunition, but ammunition didn't replace trained infantrymen. The 101st Airborne was bleeding out slowly. Mitchell looked across the frozen field at the German positions. Somewhere out there, German soldiers were making the same calculations. How long could the Americans hold? When would they run out of men, ammunition, or willpower? And what would happen when one side finally broke? He didn't have answers, but he knew that tomorrow would bring more artillery, more probes, more casualties. And he'd be right here in this foxhole, fighting a battle he'd never trained for, because his glider had landed in Bastogne and the army needed every man it could get. Mitchell spent 3 days in that foxhole, December 28th, 29th, 30th. The pattern Hansen described repeated exactly. German probes at night, artillery barrages at dawn and dusk, cold rations, no sleep longer than 2 hours. By the third day, Mitchell had stopped counting the hours. Time became a blur of explosions and rifle fire and frozen dirt. On December 30th, the company rotated off the line. A fresh unit from the 326th Engineers took over their sector. Mitchell and Hansen walked back to the company assembly area. Mitchell hadn't slept in a bed since landing 3 days earlier. The assembly area was a partially destroyed church basement. 50 men sleeping on stone floors. But it was warm. There was hot coffee. Real food. Mitchell ate 2 K rations and fell asleep sitting against a wall. He woke 6 hours later. A sergeant was shaking his shoulder. "Captain wants all glider pilots at battalion headquarters. Now." Mitchell walked through Bastogne in daylight for the first time since landing. The town was worse than he'd imagined. Every building damaged. Most streets blocked by rubble. Dead horses frozen in the snow. The smell of cordite and death everywhere. Battalion headquarters was in a schoolhouse basement. 12 glider pilots were assembled when Mitchell arrived. He recognized 2 from his training class. The others were strangers. A major from 9th Troop Carrier Command stood at the front of the room. "Gentlemen, you've done your duty as infantry. Now we need you back. Transport trucks are leaving for France tomorrow morning 0600. You'll return to your squadrons." Mitchell felt relief and guilt simultaneously. Relief that he was leaving. Guilt that Hansen and the rest of the rifle company were staying. The major continued. "The resupply mission on December 27th cost us 17 gliders and 21 pilots. 5 more pilots are missing, presumed captured or killed. The ones in this room are the survivors. 21 pilots dead, out of 50 who'd flown the mission. 42% casualties, higher than the initial estimates, higher than any glider mission in the European theater." The major didn't soften the numbers. "You flew into a meat grinder and delivered the ammunition that kept the 101st fighting. General McAuliffe asked me to convey his personal thanks." The major dismissed them. Mitchell walked back to the church basement. Hansen was awake, cleaning his rifle. Mitchell told him about the transport trucks. Hansen nodded. "Figured they'd pull you pilots out eventually. Can't train new glider pilots as fast as infantry replacements." He was right. Glider pilot training took 12 weeks. Infantry basic training took 8. Mitchell asked how long Hansen thought the siege would last. Hansen shrugged. "Patton's corridor is holding. Reinforcements are trickling in. Germans are running out of steam. Maybe another week. Maybe 2. Depends on whether Hitler commits more reserves." He paused. "You did good work out there. For a pilot." That night, Mitchell couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the glider pilots who hadn't made it. Flight Officer Gerald Knott, shot down on approach. His glider had exploded mid-air. No remains recovered. Lieutenant Wallace Britt, captured after crash landing in German territory, presumed prisoner of war. Captain James Hendricks, killed when his glider hit a stone wall on landing. The list went on. 21 names. 21 pilots who'd volunteered for a mission everyone knew was suicide. They'd flown fabric-covered gliders through concentrated flak to deliver ammunition to surrounded soldiers. No engines, no parachutes, no second chances. And most of them had died doing it. But the ammunition had gotten through. 96 tons. Enough to keep the 101st Airborne fighting for another week. Enough to hold Bastogne until reinforcements arrived. Enough to prevent the Germans from cutting Patton's corridor and resurrounding the town. The mission had succeeded, at a cost of 42% casualties. Mitchell tried to calculate whether it was worth it. 21 pilots dead to save maybe 2,000 infantrymen. The math worked. But the math didn't account for the 21 families who'd received telegrams, the 21 empty seats at squadron briefings, the 21 sets of personal effects shipped home. On December 31st, Mitchell boarded a truck convoy heading west. 12 glider pilots, 1 truck. The convoy rolled through Patton's corridor. Mitchell saw the wreckage of the German offensive. Destroyed panzer tanks, burned-out vehicles, frozen German soldiers in roadside ditches. The Bulge was collapsing. The Germans were in retreat, but it had cost the Allies dearly. The convoy reached the airfield in France by nightfall. Mitchell's squadron had already received replacement gliders, new CG-4As, fresh fabric, undamaged frames, ready for the next mission. The squadron commander briefed them. Operation Varsity is scheduled for March. Rhine crossing. Biggest airborne operation of the war. We'll need every glider pilot we can get. Mitchell looked at the new gliders lined up on the runway. Wooden frames, fabric skin, flying coffins. He'd survived Bastogne. 42% of his fellow pilots hadn't, and now the Army was asking him to do it again. Bigger mission, higher stakes, more gliders, more casualties. He thought about Hansen still sitting in that foxhole outside Bastogne, fighting every night, waiting for the next German probe, the next artillery barrage. Hansen didn't have a choice. He'd stay in that foxhole until the siege ended, or he was killed or wounded. Mitchell had a choice. He could request a transfer, ground duty, training assignment, anything but combat glider missions. But 21 pilots had died delivering ammunition to soldiers like Hansen, and those soldiers were still fighting, still holding, still bleeding. Mitchell made his decision. He'd fly the next mission, and the one after that, for as long as the Army needed glider pilots, because someone had to fly the wooden planes into hell. And Mitchell was one of the few who'd survived to do it again. The story of the Bastogne glider mission spread through 9 Troop Carrier Command slowly, not through official channels, through letters, through conversations in mess halls, through pilots who'd survived telling pilots who hadn't flown. By January 1945, every glider pilot in the European theater knew what had happened on December 27th, and most understood what it meant. The Army Air Forces didn't publicize the mission. No press releases, no newsreel footage, no medals ceremony. Glider pilots occupied a strange position in the military hierarchy. They wore pilot wings, but flew aircraft without engines. They had flight status, but became infantry after landing. The Army treated them as expendable. Cheaper to lose a glider pilot than a bomber crew. Faster to train a replacement. But the soldiers who'd received the ammunition knew better. The 101st Airborne held Bastogne for 3 more weeks after the glider resupply. They repelled 14 major German attacks. They held the corridor open while reinforcements poured through. By mid-January, the German offensive had collapsed completely. The Bulge was eliminated. American forces were advancing east again. General McAuliffe wrote a letter to 9 Troop Carrier Command in February. Mitchell saw it posted on the squadron bulletin board. The glider pilots who flew into Bastogne on December 26th and 27th demonstrated courage beyond measure. They delivered ammunition when we needed it most. They saved lives. They helped us hold. I will never forget what they did. The letter was signed, filed, and largely ignored by higher command. The casualty reports were finalized in March. December 26th mission. 11 gliders dispatched. 11 landed successfully. 0 pilot casualties. December 27th mission. 50 gliders dispatched. 32 landed in the perimeter. 18 lost en route or shot down. 21 pilots killed. 5 captured. 3 wounded. Combined casualty rate. 34% glider losses. 32% pilot casualties. For comparison, D-Day glider operations in Normandy had suffered 7% pilot casualties. Market Garden in Holland had recorded 9%. Bastogne's 32% made it the deadliest glider mission of the war to that point. The numbers were stark. 1 out of 3 pilots who flew the mission didn't come back. Mitchell learned the fates of individual pilots gradually. Flight Officer Gerald Knott, killed instantly when his glider exploded from a direct flak hit. Body never recovered. Lieutenant Wallace Britt, captured after crash landing short of Bastogne, 4 months as a prisoner of war. Captain James Hendricks died on impact hitting a stone wall. First Lieutenant Charles Morrison lost his left eye to shrapnel but survived. The medical team that landed on December 26th had their own story. Dr. Lamar Suter and his 4 fellow surgeons operated continuously for 3 days, 87 surgeries in 72 hours. They saved an estimated 60 soldiers who would have died without immediate surgical intervention. Suter received the Silver Star. The citation mentioned courage. It didn't mention he'd volunteered to fly into a besieged town in a wooden glider with no guarantee of surviving the landing. Mitchell stayed at the squadron through winter. New pilots arrived to replace the dead. Fresh faces, no combat experience. Mitchell watched them train, watched them practice landings, watched them load gliders with cargo. He knew what they didn't, that training meant nothing when flak started bursting around your aircraft, that all the practice in the world couldn't prepare you for flying through a curtain of 88mm shells, that some of them would die on their first mission. By March, the squadron was preparing for another operation, Operation Varsity, Rhine crossing, bigger than Bastogne, more gliders, higher stakes. Intelligence predicted heavy casualties. Mitchell volunteered. So did most of the Bastogne survivors. Not because they wanted to fly into flak again, because someone had to, and they knew what to expect. The night before Varsity, Mitchell thought about Bastogne, about Hansen still fighting in some foxhole somewhere, about the 21 pilots who hadn't made it back, about the ammunition crates he delivered that had kept soldiers alive for another day. The math was simple. 21 pilots dead, thousands of soldiers saved. The mission had worked, at a terrible cost, but it had worked. Mitchell wrote another letter to his mother, sealed it, left it with his personal effects, and prepared to fly into hell one more time. Because that's what glider pilots did. They flew wooden aircraft without engines or parachutes into enemy fire. They landed in combat zones. They became infantry. They did whatever the mission required. And if they died, another pilot would take their place. That was the job. Mitchell had survived once. Tomorrow, he'd find out if he could survive twice. Operation Varsity launched on March 24, 1945. Mitchell flew in the second wave. His glider carried a jeep and 4 soldiers. The landing zone was 3 miles east of the Rhine. German flak was heavier than Bastogne. The sky filled with black bursts. Mitchell's tow plane took hits, but kept flying. They reached the release point. Mitchell cut loose, descended through the flak, landed hard in a plowed field. The jeep broke free during impact. 1 soldier was killed, 3 survived. Mitchell became infantry again. The battle lasted 8 hours. By evening, the bridgehead was secure. Allied forces were pouring across the Rhine. Mitchell survived. 38% of the glider pilots didn't. Higher casualties than Bastogne. Higher than any glider mission in history. But the bridgehead held. The war in Europe had 2 months left. Mitchell returned to his squadron in April. The war ended in May. He'd flown 2 combat glider missions, Bastogne, Varsity, both times into concentrated flak, both times in wooden aircraft with no engines and no parachutes. Both times he'd survived when the statistics said he shouldn't have. He went home to Iowa in June. The Army discharged him with an air medal and a case of nightmares he'd carry for 50 years. The glider program was discontinued in 1948. The CG-4As were scrapped. A few ended up in museums. Most were burned or buried. The Army had built 13,900 gliders during the war. By 1950, fewer than 50 remained. The rest had been destroyed in combat or disposed of as worthless surplus. The glider pilots scattered. They found other work, other lives. Most never talked about what they'd done. When they did, people didn't believe them. Wooden planes? No engines? Flying into flak? It sounded impossible. But it had happened. And the men who'd done it carried the memories alone. Mitchell died in 2003, 83 years old, heart failure. His obituary mentioned he'd served in World War II. It didn't mention Bastogne. It didn't mention the glider mission. It didn't mention the 21 pilots who died flying wooden aircraft through German flak to deliver ammunition to surrounded soldiers. The newspaper didn't know. Mitchell had never told anyone outside his family. But the mission had mattered. 61 gliders attacked German lines on December 27, 1944. 32 landed successfully. 96 tons of ammunition delivered. The 101st Airborne held Bastogne because of that ammunition. They repelled German attacks. They kept the corridor open. They prevented Hitler's last offensive from succeeding. Thousands of American soldiers survived because glider pilots flew into hell to bring them bullets. Today, a few CG-4A gliders remain in museums. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio has one. The Airborne and Special Operations Museum in North Carolina has another. Silent Wings Museum in Texas preserves the glider pilot story. Visitors can see the wooden frames, the fabric skin, the simple controls, and they can try to imagine what it took to fly these aircraft into combat. At the Bastogne War Museum in Belgium, there's a small exhibit about the glider resupply missions. A few photographs, some ammunition crates, a piece of fabric from a crashed CG-4A. The exhibit mentions that glider pilots delivered critical supplies during the siege. It doesn't list the names of the 21 pilots who died. Those names exist only in military records and family memories. The glider pilots who flew into Bastogne were volunteers. They knew the risks. They flew anyway. Not for medals or recognition. They flew because soldiers on the ground needed ammunition, and because someone had to deliver it. They became the forgotten heroes of the Battle of the Bulge. The pilots who flew wooden planes without engines or parachutes through concentrated flak to save thousands of lives. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about glider pilots who saved lives with wooden planes and raw courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure these glider pilots don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.